Okay, today I have an opportunity to speak to someone who, in a very real way, is kind of father to us all. His name is Herbie Hancock. If you don't know him, you don't live on this planet. He is an amazing musician. He's been involved in so many things and continues to be involved in an amazing number of things. And we're going to try and dive into a bunch of them. Now, one of the things I'll say at the beginning is oftentimes in the podcast we talk about people's backgrounds, but this is a case where we have an opportunity to point you to something particular. There's an autobiography that was written called Possibilities. That's about Herbie's life, and realistically, it's the place to go for a lot of his background and his beginning stories. It's a tremendous dive into that background. But so that being said, let's say hello to Herbie. Hey, Herbie, how's it going?
Great, Darwin. How you doing?
I'm all right. Thanks so much for taking time out of your schedule to have this chat. Why don't we kick this off by having you talk a little bit about some of the stuff that you're working on right now?
Okay, I'm working on a new record. Actually, the working on a new record has become old. I've been working on it for 2 years so far, and counting. But I've targeted like June as next month.
Sure.
Hopefully, I can release some of it. Maybe 2, 3, maybe 4 things.
I see. Okay.
Maybe 3 things.
Yeah. Is this something that you're looking to release digitally?
How can you not release something digitally today?
Yeah, good point. Good point. I guess you could send out cassette tapes or something, I guess, right? I guess I was thinking more in terms of like streaming specifically rather than having like CDs created or something like that.
Well, the label may insist on there being some CDs.
Some sort of physical, yeah.
But the main thing is it'll be iTunes and other forms.
Services, right. Yeah. So a lot of the work that you've been doing over the last decade really has been a lot of work, collaborative work and duet work. I mean, whether it's the work that you did with Flying Lotus or some of the things you did like the Imagine Project and even the Possibilities record. You did a lot of duets. What is it that kind of drove you to working with individuals in that way? What did you find compelling about that?
Variety.
Yeah.
And the fact that I got a chance to work with stellar creators, and artists, and to have the great opportunity to work with them and create something in tandem with them. It's very stimulating to my own creativity.
Sure.
To try to figure out how to make something work with Paul Simon, for example. His background is different than mine. His musical background is different. His experiences are different, and to try to an idea that he may have that he might not be able to on his own execute musically and needs somebody to kind of realize it for him. I had to really dig deep to be able to do. He presented a puzzle to me, right? I mean, he didn't know it was a puzzle, but I knew it was a puzzle. It was. He said, "How can we do this song with just one chord?" And it was a song that he had written years ago that had a lot of chords in it,
right?
Right. And my challenge was exactly that. How can I meet that? I knew that I couldn't just use one chord, but how can I make some kind of compromise that we might agree to? And I figured it out. It was actually having a bass note that didn't move.
Right.
And then the chords moved around it, but I tried to change the chord structure in a way that sounded like it was rooted in that one bass note. And then there was a release that went to a couple other chords, and he was totally happy with it.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, that sounds amazing. Now, it strikes me that with your long playing career that sometimes having those experiences of almost having to do improbable stuff probably is one of the great excitements that you get to interact with, huh?
Yeah, because I remember when Paul said that, my inner voice said, "No, that can't be done." And then before I blurted anything out, I said, "Wait a minute." And I remembered something that Miles Davis taught me without purposely teaching me something. And I wrote about it in my book. And it was when I played a wrong chord at the peak of the evening of one of the best concerts on our tour, when Miles' solo was peaking and we had the audience in the palm of our hands, and I played this really wrong chord. And it was so loud and so strong. There was a space, and I just hit that chord. All of a sudden, I felt like I was getting smaller and smaller. And I was purposely getting smaller to sink into the carpet, right?
Right.
But Miles took a breath, and he played some notes, and he made my chord right. He made it fit. And it took me years to figure out what he did. He did what jazz musicians traditionally do, which is not to judge what somebody else plays. He didn't judge what I played, but I did.
Right.
So it was my problem was judging it as wrong. Miles's issue was, how can I make this, whatever this new thing was that just came up, how can I make that fit into the grand scheme of things?
Right.
And he did.
Yeah. Well, Miles was really influential in a lot of different parts of your kind of coming up through the music world. And one of the ways was, if I recall correctly from the book, he was kind of there and very supportive of your first moves into technology, right?
Yeah. The first time I played an electric instrument, which was the Fender Rhodes piano, it was because Miles had called a recording session. We get down to the studio, and everybody's kind of warming up, and I'm looking around for the piano, and I didn't see one. And so I said to Miles, I said, what do you want me to play? And he pointed to the corner of the room. He said, play that. And I saw there was a Fender Rhodes piano. I'd actually seen maybe a photograph of one,
Mm-hmm.
but I'd never seen one. It had, personally, I never played one. But I started thinking about, and my first thoughts were, huh? You want me to play that? Piano players, we don't like that instrument. That's not a real instrument. And all kinds of negative things, I'm thinking. But Miles asked me to play it. So I brought it over, turned it on, and I played a chord on it. And it sounded pretty. And I went, this has a nice sound. I mean, I was shocked. But something occurred to me that was very important. And that was that I used someone else's judgment and made it my own before I even had my own experience
Right.
with the thing. That's a life lesson I learned.
Yeah.
But I didn't realize that until later when I started practicing Buddhism. That's when I realized that was a life lesson. Yeah.
Right. I'm going to want to come back to the discussion of Buddhism, because I think that is certainly in your book, that's such an important thread that pulls together back your life. But I want to ask a few more things before we get there. So that was your introduction to an electric instrument. What was the point at which you started thinking of your primary instrument as being either an electric instrument or an electronic instrument? What was the instrument, or what was the thing that compelled you to say, now this is my thing, rather than an acoustic keyboard?
That hasn't happened yet.
Oh, really?
Right. No, my primary instrument is the piano when it comes to a musical instrument. But actually, my primary instrument is me and my life.
Yeah.
That's what plays the instrument.
Sure.
That's what makes the music. So the external physical instrument that I play is secondary.
Mm-hmm.
But of those, the piano is the main one.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a great point. But of course, my podcast is about music and tech, so we have to talk about some of that stuff too.
Which is fine.
Right.
The thing is, in a way, your question, you asked me to make that kind of judgment call, but I don't really think that way.
Right. For you, I almost asked it backwards, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry about that. Now, one of the things, though, that is really true, people kind of view you as always being willing to put yourself out there with technology. Kind of embrace things early, perform with it, and kind of use it to create your own voice. And there are a couple of spots where everyone can point to almost a sea change in the acceptance of technology in music, and you're at a center of an awful lot of them. Whether it's the Headhunters bringing this aggressive electronic sound to jazz, or Rockit, which sort of like brought a lot of hip hop styles like right up to the everyman's radar, right? You've always kind of put yourself in that position. In your book, you talk a little bit about having always had this interest and almost innate understanding of gear and of technology. That was something that seemed really natural to you.
Yeah. Well, let me just say that I was interested in technology before I was interested in music.
Really?
Yes. Well, because I remember when I was a kid, I wondered and I wrote about this too. How does a clock work?
Right.
I remember taking one apart and then seeing how some of it worked, and then putting it back together. It was, it wasn't electronic, but still, it's that same mindset. And I've always been curious about things. But the second component is that I've always been curious about putting something together that everybody says won't go together.
Right.
If you want to get me started on a project, just tell me putting this together with this will not work, and then I immediately have to do it. Musically, I've been able to do that.
Right. Yeah. Really, really, very much so. I mean, even to the point. Again, another thing that's kind of like throughout your whole career. I'll never forget when I saw the news of the new Herbie Hancock release called the Joni Letters, right? And I was like, what?
Yeah.
It was something where if I had to shake two dice and one came up Herbie Hancock and the other one came up Joni Mitchell, I'd be like, oh, that didn't work all right. And I'd shake them again, right? I would never imagine that would have played out, but it turned out to be an incredible album.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you, Joni listened to jazz artists when she was young, like 9 and 10 years old. And that is like the first kind of music for her. So she comes from that jazz ethic, and people don't know. I didn't even know that for a long time. But Joni, in her bands, some of the latter part of her career, who did she hire? She had Jaco Pastorius on bass. She had Michael Brecker on saxophone.
Athenian guitar.
Yeah. Exactly. Don Elias on drums.
That's right.
And then, look how many times Wayne Shorter has been on her records.
Right.
She loves Wayne. Oh, by the way, if you want to hear a great conversation, you should hear a conversation between Joni Mitchell and Wayne Shorter. Those are like diamonds.
Really?
Because they think alike, they talk alike, they understand each other perfectly. They're like diamonds if you can keep up with
it. Right.
It's pretty amazing. Both of them are used to using imagery in their language,
right.
To describe so many things and parables and.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up Wayne Shorter because while on one hand you do a lot of stuff where you're always kind of pushing yourself into new things or new collaborations, you still have this really long interaction with Wayne. What is it about him where you and he share the same thought patterns or whatever? What is it that keeps that connection through all this time?
I think there's a karmic relationship between Wayne and I.
Mm-hmm.
Somehow that's in maybe past lives.
Right.
And I met him, I think it was like early 1963 when I met him. It could have been 62, somewhere between 62 and 63. We were on a Donald Byrd record. Donald Byrd, great trumpet player. And then in 1963, I joined Miles Davis's band. 64, Wayne became a new member of Miles's band. And then we were in the band through the rest of my tenure, which was through to 1968. And Wayne continued on with Miles, but Wayne and I have been like brothers, in a way, for more than 50 years. He's my best friend.
Yeah. Oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
You guys still tour and perform a lot together, right?
It's on and off because, I mean, he has his own band.
Right.
But we made this one record called 1+1.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just a duet record. You know, periodically there have been occasions when we've been able to either tour together or just have a one-off or a couple of gigs where we just play as a duet.
So, talking about Wayne, and knowing some of his beliefs too, it maybe does give us an opportunity to return to this discussion of Buddhism. One of the things that came away as a really strong echo at the end of reading that book was the way that Buddhism has affected your life and the lives of people around you.
Mm.
Um, but it's funny because one of the things that happens, and as music becomes maybe extracted somewhat from the soul and more considered a technological adventure or whatever, it seems like a lot of times we're separating ourselves from maybe the soulful or spiritual aspects of music making and of our lives in general. And I wanted to talk to you specifically about how does Buddhism first of all, how did you get drawn into it, and
Mm-hmm.
then how does it affect your language with yourself about creativity?
The way you began phrasing your question, you talked about different aspects of what a musician might be, you know, the technical musician with, you know, voltage control filters and all kinds
Right,
of things.
the gearheads, right? Yeah.
Here it is, right. And, but then the other part is playing a ballad, for example, and you're reaching inside to bring something out musically. And then another part is interacting as jazz musicians, we improvise. And so we interact creatively and compositionally with other musicians. And so when you're playing in a jazz group and say that emphasis is on the saxophone player and he's improvising, everybody else is trying to do their best to make everything that happens somehow create a whole. WHOLE.
Mm-hmm. Right.
and so that is kind of triggering an empathetic response, because people are empathizing each other. So that is a human quality, so it's almost a humanitarian quality to be able to interact with someone, even someone you don't know.
Right.
If you're in a jam session, you don't know all the musicians that are there. We've all heard the phrase, the saxophone cutting contest, or, this person versus that person, right? Chick Corea versus Herbie Hancock. Chick and I we never played like that. You
Right.
can't, that doesn't work. We may challenge each other, but it's in fun.
Mm-hmm.
It's not to really embarrass anybody else, or because that leads to the worst kind of result
Right.
that you could get, because nobody's going to enjoy hearing that, and everybody will feel the worse for it. And as a matter of fact, there have been musicians, I've experienced this, that have walked on stage and their idea is to play better than somebody else, but to kind of make the other person sound like nothing. Right?
Yeah.
Usually those guys don't last. I don't care how good they are, how great they are as musicians, they don't last very long because nobody wants to hire people like that. So anyway, what Buddhism does is it takes, through practicing Buddhism, it helps you to see things more clearly. One of the things is to see more clearly how the different aspects of your life are centered really around one main aspect of your life, and that is the connective tissue is that you're a human being. So what Buddhism does is help you to integrate all the different aspects of your life. so that instead of it being separate compartments, it's one whole. So I'm not different as a human being as I am as a musician, as I am interacting with another person. I don't feel, so that helps you to respect yourself. But Buddhism is also about respecting everybody else.
Right.
And one of the main tenets of Buddhism we practice, which is Nichiren Buddhism, by the way, and the organization is called Soka Gakkai International, or SGI.
Okay.
And so in this practice, what we believe is that, this idea of being enlightened, or the Buddha nature is actually the deepest part of life. Anything that's living actually has a Buddha nature. But in human beings, it's dormant in a way until you awaken it. And awakening it is why I do this practice of Buddhism. And it's clarifying. You see a lot of things more clearly, more broadly. I'm saying everybody's the Buddha.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, that's it. So if we're all equal in that way, that means if you deserve respect, it means that everybody deserves respect, because everybody is the Buddha, whether you realize it or not, And so the main thing is to not only help yourself elevate your own life, but to help other people elevate their own lives too.
It's really interesting because that kind of conceptually stitches together so many of the different things that I think of as your life, whether it's leading or being parts of amazing groups, doing these recording sessions with duets or new artists, but also doing things like humanitarian stuff with the United Nations, doing educational things out there in LA and even online and stuff like that. It starts making it seem like all these things are very interconnected for you.
They are.
So let's talk a little bit about how you take music and your interest in technology and stuff like that, and how does that then come into play and influence your humanitarian work and your work outside of the music sphere?
When I first came on the music scene, right, and I wanted to write music for a record that I was going to do, like the position I'm in now, trying to put a record together. At the time, I would think, okay, let's write a tune, right, and start out with a bass line, for example, right? Mm-hmm. And I would just be thinking about what I would do musically. And everything would spring from that. Now, first question I ask myself is, why do I want to make a record? What's the purpose? That's a whole different ballgame.
Right.
As soon as you think about purpose, it gives you a platform that has to do with life. And it has to do with not just your own life, but when you make a record, people listen to it. So it's a life and their life. What is it that you want to spread? What is it that you want to encourage in other people? That's the first thing I think about now. And we're living in an age that, because of technology, change is happening at an unprecedented rate. And we all feel that, we all notice it, and it's creating a turmoil because it's so difficult for older people to be able to kind of keep up, generally speaking. So the idea of staying in your comfort zone, that doesn't work.
Doesn't even exist anymore, I don't think, right?
Well, there are people living and breathing that their apple cart is completely upset.
Right.
Because it doesn't fit, like you say, into the comfort zone. And so what I try to do is encourage people to have the courage to remove the fences around that comfort zone. Because human beings have infinite potential. And that infinite potential doesn't fit into a zone.
Right.
There are no zones, see. But that's scary for a lot of people and difficult for them to accept.
Right.
But I think it's important, and what I try to do, what many people try to do, is to live what you believe in, And so I want to expand. I want to try new things. I've gotten great encouragement for expanding and growing. And Donald Byrd was one of the first to encourage that. Miles Davis was like a main person in encouraging that expansion. And Daisaku Ikeda, he's my life mentor. He's the president of the Soka Gakkai or SGI organization that I belong to, the Buddhist organization. And that's like one of the main things is that your life has no limits. And also it takes courage to step outside of what used to be comfortable. But you know what? When we come out of the womb, right, and we see people walking around on two legs, and we can't do that, we're crawling around, what do? We try to stand up on two legs. So what happens? We fall down. But do we stay down? Nope. And again, we fall a lot of times until we get used to walking on two legs. That kind of courage, to keep that throughout your whole life, so that you're constantly expanding into areas where you may not be comfortable at first, but eventually you'll get there. What that does is that builds your courage. That kind of experience is what actually keeps you young.
Right, right.
So we never have to give in to being old. Yes, we have these numbers, right? But you can maintain that youthful spirit throughout your life. And that's by not giving in to just getting old.
Right. So what are the things that you do that are like right now? What are the things that you're doing to push your own envelope?
Okay. By the way, I chant every day. I chant Nam Myoho Renge Kyo every day. That's the practice. In case somebody want to know what it is. There's a little more to it than that, but there's a lot of details. If anybody's interested, go online and look up sgi.org.
Okay.
And anyway, they'll lead them that way.
What are the things that you do to push yourself into, to kind of be in this constant learning mode?
It kind of happens automatically because I'm curious and I'll hear about something like Bitcoins and cryptocurrency. And I wonder, what is that? And then I start investigating it and then kind of get into it, So there are constantly influences from outside or from inside that stimulate me to try something I haven't tried before. Many times it's from another person. Life is full of stuff like that. You just have to be kind of open to it. And the things I'm learning a lot from young people right now, because I really believe this is the age where they will be the primary movers. Many times people are starting to compare this age now with the 60s. And in many ways, I understand that because I was around in the 60s. Right? But I think this is going to be like the 60s on steroids.
Yeah.
Very
high velocity version of the 60s, right?
Yeah, right. I mean, everything is disrupting, like Mount Kilauea.
Yeah.
Right? And so many things that have been swept under the rug pertaining to civil rights, for example, race relations, sexism, xenophobia. There's so many things that maybe many people thought were solved. They haven't been solved, and so things, and there's a lot of divisive elements that are going around. We all know that there's a lot of fear that's happening. And so there are so many things that would need to be fixed.
Right.
But the main thing that actually I want to focus on my record is that our worst enemy is ourselves. So fixing is oneself that's probably a bad choice of words to say fix. Actually transforming yourself, like owning what your issues are, admitting them to yourself, and working on improving oneself is what we need to do.
Right.
so that we can continue to be a part of the force that moves humanity forward. That's what we're all here for. We do it in various ways, right? Everybody's got a purpose, and everybody needs everybody else. Some people who are bad as opposed to some people who are good. You know what I always say? If you want to see a bad person, look in the mirror.
Right.
You want to see a good person, look in the mirror.
Also look in the mirror. Right.
Right. We all have both those tendencies, you know. But we need those. We actually need to have issues because that's the only way you can grow, right? And we need to have these battles with yourself in order to improve your life. We need that to develop courage, compassion, empathy, understanding another person's life. If you got issues, you can understand another person having issues, and instead of just like pointing fingers at them, you can have your thumb pointing at you at the same time and say, you know, we can work together, you know.
Yeah, I sometimes wonder in our rush to try and tamp down every conflict that there is, you know, especially in our own minds. I wonder if sometimes we aren't turning off the mechanisms that allowed us to change for the better.
That's a very, very important observation you made because, I mean, it coincides with what I said is that we need to have the bad side so that we can convert the bad side into, like, for each issue that we have to deal with, to convert that into something that we can actually use to move forward.
Because that negative side tends to have a lot of power, right?
Yeah, right. and the more we move forward, the more resistance we'll get from, in Buddhism, we call it our fundamental darkness.
Okay.
So we have our fundamental enlightenment and our fundamental darkness. The object is to transform yourself so that you can find the way to transform fundamental darkness into fundamental enlightenment, you know? So in each case, seeing things from a different standpoint, we're capable of doing that. Mm-hmm. What hangs us up is when an issue comes out from us that we just see it from one standpoint. But if we can realize that there's more than one way to look at something, you know, there is a pathway to being able to turn that into something that moves us forward. Right. That's how jazz was invented.
Yeah.
That's how the blues was invented. It came out of cotton fields and slavery and racial injustice, you know. And look what that led to. It led to rock and roll, jazz, and it's still growing.
You certainly give some encouragement given the sense of dark days ahead, right? That this, you know, pointing to the fact that there's value to be gained from even confronting these things is pretty great. Our time is almost up, but before we go, I mean, first of all, people are going to browbeat me because I didn't spend enough time talking about voltage control of filter cutoffs. So I apologize to everyone on there, but you know what? There's plenty of people that'll talk to us about CV control, and there's not many people that can tell us what's in your head, Herbie. So I appreciate you letting me kind of riff on this stuff. It's really interesting. I would like to know one last thing. You are probably in one of the most unique positions in the world in general, but especially in technology and especially in music technology to be able to kind of get a whiff of what the future looks like. From your perspective, what do you feel like the future is going to look like for us?
It's going to be really interesting. And by the way, there are a lot of people talking about the future, and there are a lot of right, I believe, answers, you know, to what's going to happen. And we can see virtual reality is leading us into a whole new realm of virtual worlds. That can go in many different directions. The idea of the singularity, that actually has several definitions, but one of them is that as time progresses and the development of artificial intelligence continues to evolve, and we're seeing the use of new kinds of prosthetics for people who are losing their limbs, we're going to have the opportunity to become partly robots ourselves. There may be a time when we may be able to kind of patch into a whole new realm of interaction with say, the intelligence that's in the cloud that perhaps is in part, well, will in parts of development be due to robots and artificial intelligence itself, its own further development. I guess that's a kind of evolution. We've seen a lot of movies and maybe TV shows about things like that. I believe that will be our future if we survive as a planet or interplanetary species. And Elon Musk is right. We do need to explore other planets. I'm just afraid that we have to learn to take care of this planet before we screw up another one.
Yeah, we have to learn to be good janitors before we can be CEOs, right?
Yeah, but I really do think the kind of difficult times that we live in are a launching platform for a much greater evolution of humanity toward one of ethics and humanitarian values. We have to go through this in order to get there. But we haven't been able to see a lot of the issues before. Now we're seeing them coming out in droves. But the revolution is already happening, and it's in various ways, not just left values are right and the right values are wrong. Left values are often blind to what the right issues are. We've seen that in American politics. So there's a lot of stuff we are being faced with now, but the only way you can solve a problem is to see it in the first place. So I think this is the storm before the dawn.
Well, Herbie, I want to thank you so much for, again, taking the time. It was fabulous to get to just kind of peer inside your brain and learn a little bit more about how you think about your own creative process and your interaction with the world. This concept of focusing on connectivity, I think that we all get better if we can put some of our own focus on that as well.
That's where the source is life. Creativity, that is all around you. The stimulation is there. That's the main point I wanted to bring up.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. And with that, I'll let you have the rest of your day.
Great. Okay, thanks.
Okay, many thanks to Herbie Hancock for the great discussion. We were all over the map on that one. It was fantastic. I want to thank you, the listeners, for showing up and listening to this stuff. It's been fantastic to have you on board. Please do me a favor and give me a thumbs up on Facebook or a like on iTunes or whatever the hell you do with these things. Just give me some props just because it helps other people find the podcast, and that's very helpful. I also want to thank all of the friends and family that have helped with this, including my buddies at 20 Objects, all the folks at Cycling 74, my friends at Synthtopia, the great work that Peter Kern's doing at CDM, and everything that everybody's doing. I really appreciate all the support I've gotten over the years. With that, I'm going to let you go and catch you next week. Bye.